right, welcome everyone. It's great to have you here today. I'm looking forward to talking about Git and understanding the problems that you have, the problems that I have, and how we can all help each other out. So if anybody has any questions that they want to start with, we can talk about our familiarity or our problem points, or however you want to start. I'm comfortable with that. Anybody have any thoughts?
I would love for someone to tell me how to properly use Git Revert, because I always try and mess things up and end up using Git Reset hard instead.
That's not one that I use a lot. I'll say that.
I like the idea of in Git history, including that like a commit was reverted. Like that feels like the thing to do. And instead I always end up like rewriting history so that the bad thing never happened. And I'd like to be better about that.
Gotcha. Anybody have thoughts on that? Does anybody use that command?
I was just going to try to get a little more detail about like what happens when you do use Git Revert. Like, is there a state that you tend to find yourself in when that happens that causes you to do a reset?
I think there have been a few times when I committed code that I shouldn't have, and I thought, oh, perfect, like time to use Git. I forget if it's revert and reset do different things, and now I've confused myself. But I think I mean revert. I think revert's what I'm talking about, and this only sort of like touches on your question. But I remember there was a point where I did a Git revert, and I had that nice commit that was like, oh, I reverted this commit. And then I like tried to git pull, and I kept getting the message like everything's up to date, but it wasn't. The remote was like not up to date with the local, and that experience like turned me off to using Git Revert ever. So that doesn't really answer your question, but that is like the situation that just like scarred me.
No, it's helpful for like diagnosing. So what it sounds like to me, let's take a step back. Git Revert versus Git Reset. What do they do? Git Revert you'll point it at a specific commit that's already in your tree, and say, say you had a commit that was like you accidentally committed, I don't know, a secret or something like that. This isn't how you would clean it up, but let's just go with this example. So like I accidentally made commit Y. I need to revert it because it broke production. I would do Git Revert and then the hash of that commit. And then what would happen on my local repo is I would now have a new commit at the end of my history, or at the end of my log, that basically took the changes that were in that first commit and did the opposite of them to pull them back up. So what should happen with a Git Revert is if the history was A, B, C, D, E, and then I did one more thing to do the Git Revert, it should still be A, B, C, D, E, and then one more commit on that.
And then F, yeah.
And then F. And so like that seems like it's unlikely to cause the kind of problem where your remote would not match your local. So my hunch is that the situation that you were in, there was some sort of maybe a reset, or like gosh, why is it suddenly escaping me? A rebase. So like I think there may have been a rebase involved there, because what a rebase will do is basically, if your initial commits are A, B, C, D, E, and you choose to rebase on something else, it's now going to be like A prime, B prime, C prime, D prime, E prime. Every single one of those commits along that history will have changed. The contents of them will be exactly the same, but the hash will be different because it was based on a different point in time. So that's the situation. Git rebase is the situation that most likely causes a difference between your remote and your local. where you pull and like it just you've got to basically like totally start over. Or
Yeah, there's sorry, go ahead, Steven.
nope, go ahead.
So there's a couple different types of Git commands. There's ones that rewrite history. There's ones that only create new commits, and there's ones that rewrite history. And the rewrite history ones are where things tend to get more hairy. I think that's one of the things that you were saying, Stephen. So you always want to kind of watch out for those. They're super powerful, they're super useful, but you need to kind of understand the difference when you're doing that. So I did pop in depending on your level of experience with Git, I did pop in I'm popping in a couple different links that I found useful when I was learning Git myself. And the first one is just the Git SCM book. It's free. It's on the website, the official website. I found it's dense, but it's really good. And then the Git parable teaches you a lot about the way that Git works under the covers and gives you a little better understanding of why Git is the way it is. So that's my experience. I found I had to, when I was learning about it, I had to read like 20 different commentaries and descriptions of Git in various ways in order for it to start to click. Like, yes, oh, that's a great one. We should get. There are also, I think she's got a one that's just called "Aw Darn Git" or something like that for a more safe for work version. But yeah, so always looking at it from different perspectives and hearing different people's take on it can be super helpful in understanding, in my opinion.
Forgive me if this is more basic a question than most people here would be asking, but what exactly, or what conceptually is reset doing? Because I do use that one a lot, and I would like to know if I'm breaking things, or if that wouldn't fly in the real world, or that kind of thing.
Anybody want to take this one? Go ahead, Jake. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, because I'm just for perspective, I'm doing this in the scope of like coursework. So if I break something, there aren't really consequences, but like I want to know how to do it in the real world where I could break things and that would be bad.
I mean, there are absolutely scenarios for using reset in the real world. It just depends on what you're doing. So does anyone want to take this one or have thoughts? So one of the things that oftentimes, oh, go ahead, Steven. I thought you were
I can contribute to the conversation, but you can go first if you want to, and
sure,
I can fill in.
So, reset basically means change. So there's two different, gets confusing at times because oftentimes the same command is used for several things that are conceptually different. And so one of them is I've got uncommitted changes on my working tree. I basically just made some changes to my code and I don't actually want those changes. They were bad. They were just, that was a bad idea. And so you can essentially kind of throw those away by doing a git reset. And you can, so git reset. And so you can, the classic one is just removing the working changes. But then you can also, if I remember correctly, reset your branch to a specific commit. And that would be more throwing away commits, that kind of thing. And so potentially you could, and then if you did a hard push, for example, you could potentially be removing commits from the remote. The git push force is the scenario where you have the possibility to mess things up. If you're not doing a force as part of your push, you're not breaking anything that can't be reversed. Now, even if you, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, which one is, of those scenarios you just described, which one is -- hard? What is that doing?
So if you're just doing a git reset -- hard, it's basically saying everything that's changed in my working directory since my last commit, throw it away. And that's going to be, then there's other, I think, again, I use the documentation all the time. I do not have all the commands memorized. And frankly, I like using a GUI for a lot of things. I'm a little weird in that. A lot of other developers really like using the CLI. Forget Steven's with me. I love it. So the GUI, frankly, helps me to understand the structure of my commits and how they connect to each other. And I found it useful my entire career, even at a fairly advanced stage. So, Steven, do you want to add anything? Jake, I know you have some thoughts on Git, probably.
A couple things I would add. I don't think you're weird for using a GUI. I think that there's like a stigma around that, and there's like a little bit of a, I don't know, machismo thing
Gatekeeping?
with using the, some gatekeeping going on with using the terminal versus using a GUI for it. I also still use the GUI for some things. Like I'm a mix. I just think that some things are easier to do in the GUI.
Yes.
They fit with my mental model of what's going on a little bit better.
Yes.
The other thing I wanted to do was just kind of like give a more formal definition of git reset and say that what git reset is doing is you're telling it where to point as your current status. So like you've got this tree of commits, this history of commits that have happened. A git reset is saying, well, right now I'm at the head with the end of it. I want you to point at like 2 commits before the head. And then that modifier that's like soft or hard tells Git what to do with the changes since then. So like, do you want to keep the changes between what you have and then that previous commit? Do you want to stage them, or do you want to just like completely discard them?
Thank you. That's very helpful.
And most of these commands, you want to make sure that when you do these commands, that your working tree is, if you're not doing something specifically to affect your working tree, like if that's not your focus, try to make sure your working tree is clean, because a lot of them can deal with it, but sometimes it gets a little odd if you're trying to do things and your working tree is not clean. And that would mean there's no diffs at the current time. That your status is clean. So one of the things that I notice people get super confused about with Git particularly when they first start out, is about branching. And the terminology and a lot of other version control systems make you think that branching is like creating a new branch of the code. But in reality, a branch is nothing more than a pointer at a specific commit. And the sooner that you kind of wrap your head around that, the sooner you will become drastically more comfortable with a lot of the principles behind Git. AJ, you raised your hand or something? AJ.
Yeah, and I think you are absolutely right. That is one of the concepts we need to learn. Another thing I learned is the big difference between the old VSS or other guys, where like there are 2, earlier it was like your machine and the server. But now on, let's say, your machine, you have 2 different copies. One copy where you will commit, and the one copy is your actual working directory. So there are 2 copies on your machine right now. So that part, once you also understand that, then you realize that, okay, there is no server as such actually. And there is no remote server. I mean, it can be multiple servers also. So, and like, so my experience with Git is like, I keep it very simple. I don't know many commands. I just do, let's say, git checkout and git add and git commit, and then git push, and then it let's say gives me one error. I will just copy that saying that there is no branch after this. I just do that. And if there are multiple issues, like there are multiple merge changes or something like that, somebody has done many things, I just stash all my work and try to see whatever Git can give me automatically merge. I just take that, but everything else I will do it again manually, and then again push it. The only advanced command I know probably is how to take the server, a branch from server, and merge it to another branch without checking out to that branch. So that helps me to take the master or the main branch, keep in sync with the master, and then let's see the diff. Otherwise, my workflow is pretty simple. Check out with a new branch, git add, git commit, git push, and then keep doing, let's say, git fetch in between. And then once you are done, you just delete the branch, then you move to another branch based on your work item. How do you do? Whether you're working on let's say, feature or a bug.
Other thoughts and questions? One of the things that for me, when I was first getting accustomed to version control, and this was not, not specific to Git, because I actually didn't get started with Git. I was a little before it took over the world entirely, was I was thinking about version control, and the cat behind you is awesome, stupid, as like a backup. And that took me a while to get through that, because it was as if I felt like the local version was the gold standard. Like my copy, whatever I've recently built, was my gold standard. And I was just making backups of my code. But version control doesn't work that way, really. What do you want? This is pretty basic, and I'm sure most of you have this at this point, but I just want to make sure we've established this, that when what's committed to the version control, that's the gold standard. And the changes you're making on top of that are kind of just what you're playing with until it's been committed. Does anybody else feel similarly or feel differently? I'm curious if people have thoughts on that.
For me, the gold standard is more like let's say what is in the main branch, and I can create another branch also. Sometimes they may not be just maybe let's say silver standard, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, I mean that's pretty true. What do you say?
Like it's not real until I've committed it. Whereas, before, I was a programmer working with like code, it was real as soon as I'd written that, and then I backed it up to make sure I didn't lose it.
The code doesn't matter to anyone else until you've committed it, right?
Right.
So.
So does anybody use Rebase? Anybody like it? Anybody not? Yeah, nice. Jake, very cool.
I didn't use it for the longest time because I had a better so really kind of what it came down to is I had a few things that got into some nasty Rebase issues, and then no one on my team wanted to deal with it either. For me or for themselves, so they just merged everything.
Right.
And it wasn't until I got a little more just comfortable with Git and version control in general that I just said, okay, time to start, addressing this head on. And I haven't had any issues with it, in a while. But my understanding is it's just in terms of a clean history, it's a better way to go rather than, because one thing you can do on a feature branch to make sure there are no conflicts with the main branch is to merge the main branch into the feature branch, deal with the merge conflicts there, then merge that back. But my understanding is that kind of leads to some messy commit histories, and that rebasing is a cleaner way. And again, I can't really kind of like AJ said, like my experience with Git is pretty simple, straightforward. Like for the most part, there's just a few commands that I use all the time, and it's just fine. So I think that's part of it too. Is I will say, so one other thing I guess I'll add is if you keep your commits small, and if you're working with a team and everybody is doing that, that's going to like preventatively address 99% of your merge conflicts and Git history issues. Is just like small atomic commits and then pull down and then the same. It's just I worked with somebody early on this team who like it'd be like a day or two before they push a commit, and you're just like, oh, this is gonna be bad. I've been guilty of it, too. But like once you realize how powerful like it is to just have very, very small, precise commits, it's like I said, I think it just solves a lot of the issues you can otherwise get yourself into. Small commits backed by tests. I should say that, where you can make a change, run your tests, commit the code, move on. That's a really good way to keep yourself out of any, I think, nasty Git trouble just to begin with.
What do you find are the most helpful in practice for how you're using it? Messages to put with your commits? Like what kinds of things do you put in there that are actually helpful for a project?
That's a good question. I don't know that I've got a good answer for it, to be honest. I mean, I guess I will say it's easier to put meaningful messages in when the commits are small, because the commit only, it's kind of like a good function name, or a good, a small function that does one thing is really easy to name because it's a function that does one thing. You just name what it does. But if it's doing 15 different things, it gets a little bit harder to think of like, well, what do I say about this, or what do I call this function? And it's kind of the same with your commit messages. Like smaller commits that were just about changing one thing are easier to name, so to speak, or create a meaningful message for that just says what you did with that commit.
I'm gonna share a couple PRs from my teammates. One of them is an example of what I find to be really useful commit messages, and one of them I find to not be useful at all. And I think when you see the second one, you'll know what I mean. So just give me 30 seconds to find these.
Another thing I especially learned to keep those messages like small, or let's say Git check-ins very atomic, is when you work on, let's say, feature branch, when you work on, let's say, new development, it is fine even if you can keep your Git check-ins a larger size. But if you're working on a let's say maintenance branches for, let's say, version 1, version 2, version 3, and you are currently working on version 5, and when you are doing bug fixing, it is absolutely essential that you only check in let's say really atomic fixes, because sometimes you need to take that fix from branch V4 and apply that to branch V3, and from branch V3 to branch V2. And sometimes people, what happens is that they don't want to do lot many PRs because they have to follow up with lot many people to approve their PR. So they try to merge all their changes into one PR. So that will reduce time, build time, test time. And it's a natural habit that I don't want to follow people on multiple times. Say, can you approve my PR1, PR2, PR? So they like to merge it together. But then in such cases where you have to cherry pick a Git from V4 to V3, and there is but that bug may not exist in V3 actually. That file may not exist in V3. So that becomes very problematic. So maintaining an old code base versus Git check-ins for a new feature branch has two totally different, you need totally different approach for that. So at least for maintenance branches, make sure that you are totally atomic. Only check in, only that is required for your, let's say, bug fix. Don't check in anything else.
Just gonna read off some of those bad commit messages. Aha, let's go, more, aha, more, no aspect, almost, done, aha. It's kind of a running joke with that particular engineer. He really likes to make those tiny commits with messages that don't help anybody.
Yeah. It reminds me of that XKCD I just posted.
He's a lovely person.
I don't doubt that, yes.
So
So-
I don't, this is maybe like a little bit dangerous or controversial, but I really like Rebase and I really like to rewrite history when I'm working locally. And Michael, you were kind of talking about how a big leap for you was when you made the distinction of like which one was the source of truth or where the, yeah. And for me, it was more like taking a leap of my Git history is not just a record of the work that I've done. It's a way for me to like tell the story of what I've done. And so one of the things that's really helpful here is small commits that do one thing with clear messages, but I tend to probably, it's you could say that this is perfectionism and it's like gold plating and not worth it, but I like to craft my commits in a way where it's helpful for people reviewing it, that I can point them to that commits tab and they can walk through and they can see. Like the first example that I shared is my coworker John, and he always does a really good job of like describing every refactoring that he's doing. And I think that's a useful thing during a code review. So look at a PR that shows me, you know, what were you thinking about as you built this thing out. I do interactive rebases all the time, and I find them to be really powerful and really a nice way to just like, also when I realize if I've gone too far down a rabbit hole on this one branch, I can be like, okay, well, I'm going to group these commits together because they're going to go in a separate branch and I'm going to create a separate PR from that. And then that helps me make sure that I'm keeping my entire branch small and keeping that PR small and easily reviewable.
I'm not
But
sure
having
that
said that, like-
everyone,
Sorry.
you're fine. I'm not sure that everyone's familiar with interactive rebase. It is, do you want to talk about that, Stephen?
Sure. Yeah, so just the caveat to all this is like, you do need to be careful when you're doing this stuff, because if you do push this stuff or force push it, like Michael said, and you're working in a shared branch, you run the risk of kind of screwing people up. But for me, like when I'm working locally, I'm thinking about, I'll push stuff up to a PR, I'll open the PR, and I'll continue to push and I'll force push. And my team and I have all agreed that that's a fine thing for any of us to do. Because if we're going to pull down someone's PR to check it out, we're just going to pull it from scratch. Interactive rebase is so rebasing a branch, like we talked about a little bit earlier, is when I have a branch of commits and I basically want to change where they're based on. So I want to move them from being based on what was in master 3 weeks ago to what was in master today. So what I might do is I might go rebase and say, okay, this branch, let's rebase it on master, latest master. It'll apply all those commits to the end of master. Interactive rebase allows you to control what you do with each of those commits during the rebase. So you can move them around. You can choose to select some of them to rebase, choose to just ignore some of them. You can combine some of the commits together, which is a useful thing if like you look at it and if I make a commit and I think I got everything that is related to this one thing, and then an hour later I realize, oh, I missed this other spot. I can make that second commit. When I do an interactive rebase, I can squash those two together or fix them up so that they're just one commit now. like that. It's one comprehensive commit that like tackles the API side of this or something. You can rename commits, which is a useful thing. There's probably other options, but those are the ones that come to mind.
It's a way to tell a story with your commits. It's a way to change, especially if you're in the middle of something and you're just like, oh, I just need to commit this. And you put in a commit message that might not be great. You can go back and change that so that you are telling a compelling story with those messages and helping people understand why you're doing the things that you're doing. It is one of the more advanced, it's a relatively advanced feature of Git, but that doesn't mean you should avoid it and just not do it. It means that it may not be the first thing you want to tackle, but you should definitely keep it in mind as you get more advanced and as you develop the capability to understand and work more adeptly within the tool.
It's more dangerous. Like you do
Correct.
have that risk of your rewriting history. And
Yes.
you do have that risk of messing other people up, which is why, like Michael had the comments about establishing an agreement about policies. If you're working with a team where they're not comfortable with history being rewritten, or they just all agree that nobody's going to force push, that's a different story. Like that's not the right place to be doing this kind of stuff. If you're in a team where you're all kind of embracing this idea of like, let's tell stories with our commits. And so that means that my branch is my branch until like I tell somebody else to review it or whatever, then it's not as much of a problem.
Absolutely. And something you can always do if you're worried that you might mess something up. This is something I've done all the time. You should just create a second branch at that same commit. If I'm getting ready to rebase and I want to rebase based on changes, I'm like, I don't know what's going to happen if I screw this up. You simply create a branch at the commit that you are currently at and you're about to rebase, and then you can either rebase that branch or the original branch, and that branch will stay there, retain that history without any problem. Even if you don't do that, you can still get back to those commits up until some point in the future, because Git doesn't throw that stuff away immediately. There's actually a background cleanup thing that happens occasionally when it's taken up too much space, but that usually runs like 28 days in the future or something like that, if I remember correctly. So you can almost as long as you've committed something, you can almost always get it back. And you can do that. One of the more popular ways to do that, I think, is using Git Reflog, which will tell you the places that your pointer has been recently.
It's an absolute lifesaver.
Yes, it is.
Reflog is a thing, like you don't know that you need it until you need it.
Yes.
Do you guys let's just squash the changes when you merge to the main branch, or you keep that all branch history? So when you're merging to the main branch, do you let's just squash it? Because I mean, we have been multiple on that side actually. Some people don't like it, some people like it.
We're similar. Some people like it, some people don't like it. We've had people try to institute just like make a decision that as an org we're going to squash, and so we try to squash. We don't enforce it with any sort of tooling, so like 80% of commits get squashed. The GitHub UI sometimes is confusing, and there's a technical reason that sometimes we need to merge branches instead of squashing, or it screws up our deployments. But so like we're switching back and forth between squashing and merging. Sometimes we merge instead of squashing accidentally.
Does anybody know anybody want to know what squashing means? Need some clarification on that.
I do.
Okay, so
Please.
yeah, so one of the more common strategies when you are merging commits into the main branch is to make each merge request into a single commit on that main branch. And so what that'll essentially do is as you're merging that merge request, it will take all those commits, squash them down into one, and then apply it to the head of the main branch. Now, you've lost some of that history of like why you did certain things at each step along the way, but you also have a single atomic commit that represents that feature or change being merged in. Steven, do you have any thoughts on that? Go ahead.
I was going to ask, what does that do for you? Like, what's the value of having the one atomic commit in that case?
Steven, I'd love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so the reason that our team advocated to do squashing instead of merging is because with commits or with merges squashed, at any point in history, you can go check out a commit and be guaranteed that you have a fully functional local environment. If we're including all the history from your working branch, there's no guarantee. Like I could go check out a commit and it might've been totally in progress with what you were doing. In addition, I think that people prefer, it reduces the amount of noise when you're looking at it. So like, it's easier to see. And like, there's arguments to both sides. Some people think it's easier to see the history when the history is, I merged this branch. Some people think it's easier to see the history when the history is like the 20 different commits that went into merging this branch. There's a whole lot of subjectivity to it.
That makes sense.
Absolutely.
And we all probably waste way too much time discussing it.
There is also a little bit interesting concern about privacy. Some people don't like to others know when they're checked in and how they work on it. Maybe I was working on weekends and I don't want people to know that I was working on weekend. That is also because one can understand that from looking at my history if I don't let's say squash the changes.
Mm-hmm.
So there are some interesting arguments on that actually.
You can always squash in the branch. You don't have to just as you're merging it into master or main. You can like Stephen was talking about with rewriting history with interactive rebase or whatever. You can change your personal history however you like to tell that story or change the narrative or whatever.
My suspicion is that, AJ, I'm kind of guessing like this. My suspicion would be that someone who was worried about people knowing that they were working on the weekend is the kind of person who's also just worried about that people know that they're behind on stuff. And so that to me, that indicates that like that advanced case of rewriting the history themselves is probably more difficult for them to do than just like clicking the button on GitHub that says squash it. I don't know, just thinking about that.
And perhaps in that specific scenario is an indication that there's some team dynamics going on that we might want to work on.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, some indicate sometimes people are not comfortable. Sometimes, I mean, it boils down to how that team works actually.
Sure. Yeah, not that specifically saying, Krishna, but just like a lot of bring up that sometimes the things when we're looking to our tools, sometimes we also need to examine what's happening in order to cause us to make the decisions we're making about our tools. And is there deeper problems that we really need to solve that are about personnel and trust and the ability, the permission to fail even. So that I think is a huge part of all of this. Yes, absolutely. Trust and psychological safety. And there's so much research about the fact that I think it was the number one trait of a successful team is psychological safety. And trusting the people that you're working with, that they are going to have your back and that they are going to work with you to make things good. There's a whole Google study about that where they were trying to determine why teams were successful. And actually, I think we had to talk about that at our first Momentum. I think we got that from CodeMash, but I can see if I can find that. What other questions do y'all have? You comfortable now? You're like, I'm a Git expert. I got this. I have seen some Git magicians do some incredible things with rewriting history. It's like, oh, you know what? Our entire, one of the more common examples of something that you have to be careful about and requires extensive care is if you have committed secrets to your history, because it's not good enough to just revert that change or to try and remove that data from the file, because it's all there in your history. And so if you actually want to remove that, if you've already published it, those secrets are dead anyway. Like, people have them. This happens. But if you have not published that repo yet, more publicly or whatever, and you want to remove that, there's rewriting that you have to do to make sure that you've cleansed those secrets from your history. And there's various blog posts about that. I do not remember how it's done because the few times, I don't even recall if I've ever had to do it, but if I do need to do it, I can find that. Essentially is what it comes down to. I'm a good Googler. Let's say that.
I don't
But
know
that
if
is
this is
one.
interesting to people.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Stephen. And then I
I was
think
just gonna
Brian.
say, like, from a like a why perspective to that story, the fact that you can go back in time and check out any commit in the history, what the reason you're able to do that is because the internals of Git are such that, like, every single commit points to a tree that contains the entire file system at that time. So, like, even if you go and you make that change to revert that one commit, there's still a way for somebody to go back and commit and check out that one commit that had the sensitive data in it.
Thank you for explaining that. I appreciate you putting that additional detail on it. Brian, did you have something?
No, I didn't. This has been a very good conversation, though, for me.
Oh, good. Excellent.
I know when we, I don't use Git currently for version control. My current job, but we used it well when I was in school, and what Jake was talking about, like doing frequent commits with descriptive comments. No, I never did that. I would do a whole day's worth of work and commit it all at the end of the day, and then exactly, like, how do you describe it, like Tuesday's work, or whatever. Yeah. So yeah, that's fantastic advice for sure.
What do you use now, Brian?
So we use Perforce Helix.
Okay.
Yeah. It's got a lot of different. I mean, it's fundamentally doing the same thing, but it's got some different concepts to it. So it's been a little bit of a challenge for me to get used to it. In fact, I would say the bulk of my challenges in my new role are related to understanding Perforce and what I'm doing when I merge and when I, check out and things like that. So yeah.
That's interesting. Thank you. Yeah, and there are definitely companies out there that are not using Git at this point. Like as we heard, I know actually Google uses their own homegrown version control system called Piper, which is super interesting. There's some talks about it that you might, if you're curious, you can check it out. But they essentially keep, see Steve, if you're, I assume you're waving by. No, okay. But they essentially keep all of their code, almost all of Google's code, in one mono repo. Like all the stuff that most of the stuff about, it's in there. This is what I heard, at least. I need to do some more research, but except for there's a few pieces of Google code that are high value IP, intellectual property, and those apparently only about a dozen people have access to, which I think is super interesting.
Are you talking about just their search engine, or are you talking about everything?
I think from what I understand, it's not just the search engine. It's like most of their products. There's some products, I think Android, they said was separate, but for instance, if they're making a change to a single utility that something is using, then that can get put out across the entire code base with one commit, essentially. That was I need to reread it, but it sounded super interesting and fraught in ways, but apparently they use a lot of feature flags, and that's the way that they deal with the complexity as opposed to branching. I know that most companies at this point, in my experience, are using Git or some form thereof. I know probably there are a lot of them still on older versions, especially for certain projects. When my first job, we used TFS, and I know some places use Plastic SCM or Subversion, those kind of things. But I think pretty much everybody's standardizing on Git these days.
One thing I like about the Git is, let's say, Git archive. So I typically even keep my personal documents on a folder within a Git. And let's say Git archive actually ignores all those files ignored by, let's say, Git ignore. So you can quickly, let's say, Git archive, and without adding your node modules folder, you can quickly, let's say, zip it. If you try to zip it, it will take the node modules typically on Windows machine. But the Git archive ignores those files. So it is pretty easy to back up also. If you just want to take a personal backup of let's say, small folder and give it to somebody, very easy. I use that most of times, Git archive, apart from typical checkout and all the stuff.
That's pretty cool. So one thing I did want to mention that I discovered recently, and I thought might be useful to others. Has anybody ever used .env files? So Stephen, do you use this artsy? Maybe else would it? But we were talking about not committing secrets to source control. And so a lot of times what you want to do is you end up pulling those secrets and variables and stuff like that out of your environment variables. And so that works well with automated deployments, or if you're deploying to a certain server. But locally, sometimes you typically don't want to. I don't know. You could add those environment variables each time, but .env files provide a way where, with a git ignored file specifically on your machine, you can put those secrets or variables in there, and then your program will automatically ingest them so that they get piped into the right places. Is that your experience, Stephen? It made my life so much easier because we started writing like these little scripts, like, oh yeah, get that pipe this, get the password from this, and then put it in here, and then run this script. But then if I restart my terminal, it's gone. It's like,
So actually, let's say .NET has a way where you can get your config from your, let's say, users folders, which stays outside your Git folder, and you can keep your environment there. So it's a way to
nice.
get the configuration.
Yeah, I know. I used to use like web config, app config, and you could. There were ways to Git ignore those, perhaps, but yeah, it. There's a lot of. I know that a lot of the ecosystem has advanced a lot since I left the .NET ecosystem. I know we're hitting around 5 o'clock, and I'm happy to hang out for a little bit longer if people have questions, but it also seems like we might be winding down. So welcome to jump if you have things to do, but also let me know if there's something I can help with. Oh, cool. Jake posted your blog. That's awesome.
So I wrote something on .env files, and it's funny because I just mentioned this recently on LinkedIn. That is the one blog post I almost didn't write because I just thought, man, people already know about this. They don't want to hear me talk about it. And it's like 70% of my blog's traffic is that one article. But
that's awesome.
It shows an example of using a .env file with a Python application, and there's a specific library in Python that you use to pull in those values from the .env file. JavaScript or Node has something very similar, where there's a library you can use to pull in those values, and it's also really nice for Docker containerized deployments, because like if you can run Docker locally, and you can, when you run the build, and most well, I shouldn't say most, but there are definitely editors that make Docker like building and running containers fairly easy, and one of the options you can do is say, hey, use this file to grab my environment variables for this Docker container. And so if you can run an application in a Docker container locally with a .env file, you can essentially test it and run it in the exact same way it would be running, elsewhere in the cloud or on-prem or whatever. And so these .env files plus Docker is like a really, really nice setup for, everyone being able to run the application in the exact same environment and in the exact same way. And then it makes transitioning from local development to deployment very, very seamless, because the only difference is, like, whatever you're deploying that container to, you'll have a different way to define those environment variables. But that's otherwise it's like identical how you're running and working with something locally, and how you're running and working with something in actually deployed and living on someone else's machine.
Very cool, Jake. Thank you. Anybody else have any thoughts or questions? Are we looking forward to the weekend? Go ahead, Jake. Sorry.
I should say one thing I guess I'd like to add to the conversation on Git, especially for anyone who is like still learning Git, still new to it, is like you don't need to know a lot. 80 to 90% of what you do and is going to be a very small but I would say, and I so this is kind of been my experience, when you do run into a problem, there's, especially if you're just like hacking around on like a personal project or whatever, there might be like an easy way to fix it of just like scrapping the branch and starting over. Don't do that. Like, look up how to fix it with Git, and that's the best way to learn the harder stuff. Like I don't know a ton of tricky stuff in Git, but I know I could figure it out if I needed to. And I do now try to embrace those, like, you know, tough Git moments and figure out the right way to fix it and kind of walk away with it from, you know, like, you know, basically I said, don't do what, you know, my team did early on, where it was like, well, we're all struggling with Rebase, so let's just merge everything and be done with it. Like, no, figure it out. And if you do that every time, you know, just kind of embrace those challenges, figure them out, you'll walk away with the knowledge that, you know, Michael and Stephen have, you know, demonstrated that I definitely I feel like my Git skills really lack. So,
It's just a matter of taking those learning opportunities where, yes, you really only need a few things to get started, but, you know, I'm always in the mindset of rounding out my skills, and not that I need to like take this new class and push through that and learn this language over here and all these other things. For me, it's usually just a matter of every day I'm just learning a little bit more, just a tiny bit more, understanding the Git process a little better, trying out this new command and like, okay, did that do what I expected it to do? And then each time you take those learning opportunities and those small steps, you gain this wealth of understanding where you just feel at home eventually. You know, you're growing is what happens. And as you grow through your developer experience, you become so much more capable over time. You know, you always see the things where it's like 1.01 to the 365th power is just this ridiculous number. And when you do that compounding, where you become just a little bit better every day and you learn just a little bit more every day, the learning does pay off big time in the long run. I think I've speechified enough for the day, probably. Cool. Thank you, everyone, today for joining. It's been a pleasure, and I hope you left a little bit more knowledge than you had to begin. And try some stuff that's a little out of your comfort range. See what you can do. So enjoy your weekend. And,
Thank you very
look forward to
much.
talking to you
It's
soon.
very helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.